Somewhere in a boardroom right now, someone is about to make a decision that will be studied in business schools for the next 50 years. Not because it was complicated, because it was obvious, and they still got it wrong. The strangest thing about the biggest business mistakes in history is that none of them happened because the people involved were stupid. These were sharp executives, experienced deal makers, people who had been right about a lot of things for a long time, and yet they looked directly at something worth hundreds of billions of dollars and either walked away from it, gave it away, or paid too much for the wrong thing. Today, I want to walk you through 10 of those moments, not as a highlight reel of failure, but as a study in something more interesting, the specific type of thinking error that keeps showing up over and over across completely different industries, completely different eras, and completely different companies, because the pattern is the same every single time. And once you see it, you'll start recognizing it in decisions that are being made right now. Let's start at the beginning. In the spring of 1976, George Lucas sat across from a group of 20th Century Fox executives and made one of the most consequential requests in entertainment history. He asked for less money up front. In exchange, he wanted something the executives considered nearly worthless: the merchandising rights and sequel control for his upcoming film. Fox said yes immediately. Of course they did. A director voluntarily taking a pay cut? Sign the papers before he changes his mind. The movie was some kind of space fantasy. Robots and laser swords and a man in a black helmet. Nobody expected it to become anything serious. On May 25th, 1977, Star Wars opened in theaters. Within weeks, every toy store in America was emptied out. By the end of 1978, merchandise alone had generated over $100 million. Money that went entirely to Lucas, not Fox. Then came the sequels, then the prequels, then Disney's acquisition of the entire franchise for $4 billion in 2012. Fox had traded the entire galaxy for a slightly smaller director's fee. But here's what actually happened in that room. The Fox executives weren't careless. They made a completely rational decision. Based on how entertainment had always worked, films made money at the box office. Merchandise was secondary. Sequels were uncertain. Nobody in 1976 had a framework for thinking about a franchise that would still be generating billions of dollars 5 decades later. They priced the rights correctly for the world they understood. The problem was the world was about to become something else entirely.
1 year earlier, and a few miles away, a different company was making a similar error, just in reverse. In December of 1979, Steve Jobs walked into Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center and saw something that stopped him completely. A graphical interface, a mouse, a desktop screen that any ordinary person could operate without training or technical knowledge. Xerox's scientists had built this years before Apple, years before Microsoft. The personal computer, the actual practical version of it, was sitting in a Xerox lab, mostly ignored by the company's leadership, because Xerox made copiers. That was the business. That was where the revenue was. The research center was impressive, but it wasn't the core. Executives glanced at it and moved on. Jobs did not move on. He brought those ideas back to Apple and used them to build the Lisa and then the Macintosh. When Xerox eventually tried to enter the personal computer market, they spent $20 million building machines nobody wanted to buy. Apple and Microsoft turned Xerox's research into the foundation of the modern technology industry. A company that invented the window watched everyone else climb through it. The lesson from both Fox and Xerox is the same. When you cannot see the value of something, you price it like it has none.
Now, let's look at the opposite problem. Because just as dangerous as undervaluing something is paying too much for the wrong thing and doing it with enough confidence that nobody in the room says stop. On May 10th, 2011, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer announced the company was acquiring Skype for $8.5 billion, the largest acquisition in Microsoft's history at that point. The logic on paper made sense. Skype had a recognizable brand. It had hundreds of millions of registered users. Communication was moving online. Microsoft wanted a piece of that future. But the numbers underneath the announcement told a different story. Skype had 170 million active users, not the 300 million the registration count implied. And it was losing money every quarter. Microsoft rushed the integration anyway. Code systems clashed, server performance suffered, call quality dropped. And while Microsoft was busy trying to make Skype work inside its ecosystem, the market moved without waiting. Apple launched FaceTime. Google pushed Hangouts. WhatsApp grew from a small messaging app into a global communication platform. By 2017, Microsoft had built its own internal product, Teams, that did everything Skype was supposed to do and did it better. Skype for Business was quietly absorbed into Teams. By 2021, the consumer version of Skype had become a footnote. Microsoft paid $8.5 billion for a product it eventually replaced with something it built itself. HP did something similar, and somehow made it worse. In August of 2011, HP announced it was acquiring a software company called Autonomy for $11.1 billion. The stated goal was transformation. HP wanted to move from hardware into software, and Autonomy was supposed to be the bridge. The market reacted immediately. HP stock dropped 20% the next day. Once the deal closed and internal teams started examining the numbers more closely, the picture got darker. Revenue had been recorded in ways that didn't hold up to scrutiny. Auditors flagged irregularities throughout the financials. A year after the acquisition, HP took an $8.8 billion write-down, erasing almost the entire value of what they had purchased. Executives blamed Autonomy's leadership. Autonomy's team denied the accusations. Shareholders were left reading a bill they never agreed to sign. HP wanted a transformation. What it got was one of the most expensive miscalculations in corporate history. The pattern here is worth pausing on. Both Microsoft and HP were attempting to buy their way into a future they hadn't built organically. Both were paying prices that assumed the assets would perform at a level the existing evidence didn't support. Both moved quickly, without enough friction in the process to catch what they were missing. Speed and confidence, without accuracy, is just expensive motion in the wrong direction. Some of the most costly mistakes in business history didn't happen because someone made a bad deal. They happened because someone walked away from a good one. In June of 1983, Atari was the undisputed dominant force in gaming. Over $1 billion in annual revenue. Household name. The company that had turned video games into an industry. Nintendo was growing fast, but still needed a major American distribution partner to launch its console, the Famicom, soon to be released as the Nintendo Entertainment System, into the US market. The two companies sat down. An agreement began to take shape. Atari would distribute the console across America and share in the profits. Nintendo got the distribution muscle it needed. Both sides were close to a signature. Then, a dispute over Donkey Kong broke the table. Atari believed Nintendo had licensed the game to a competitor in violation of their arrangement. Nintendo argued the terms allowed it. The disagreement escalated. Communication broke down. By the end of 1983, the deal was dead. The video game market crash hit Atari hard that same year. Nintendo moved forward alone, launched the NES in 1985, and eventually sold over 60 million units worldwide. Atari had been positioned to own a piece of the future of gaming. They walked away over a licensing argument about a gorilla. The Beatles story moves differently, and it's harder to watch. In March of 1969, John Lennon and Paul McCartney discovered that Northern Songs, the publishing company that controlled most of their catalog, was being sold. They each owned roughly 15% of the company. Not enough to control it, not enough to stop what was coming. They attempted to buy the catalog back. A media company called ATV moved faster and won the auction for £1.5 million. In a single transaction, the rights to Hey Jude, Yesterday, All You Need Is Love, and hundreds of other songs passed out of the band's control. 16 years later, in 1985, ATV sold the catalog again. This time, the buyer was Michael Jackson, who paid $47.5 million, outbidding Paul McCartney directly. McCartney had once advised Jackson to invest in music publishing as a long-term asset. Jackson took the advice. Then, he applied it to McCartney's own songs.
The catalog was later merged into Sony's publishing division, eventually becoming worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The most commercially successful band in the history of recorded music ended up paying royalties on their own work to everyone except themselves.
Some deals look reasonable at the time. The mistake only becomes visible later, when the thing you sold becomes worth far more than the price you accepted. In March of 2019, NBC Universal gave Disney full operational control of Hulu, even though NBC still held a 33% ownership stake in the platform. The reasoning wasn't irrational. NBC was preparing to launch its own streaming service, Peacock. Managing a stake in a competitor's platform was complicated. Handing over operational control while retaining the financial stake seemed like a clean middle position. 2 months later, NBC signed a put-call agreement that allowed Disney to buy that 33% for a minimum value of $5.8 billion, regardless of how large Hulu grew. Then, the streaming era arrived in full force. Hulu crossed 48 million subscribers. Advertising revenue expanded. The platform's value climbed steadily. NBC, meanwhile, began pulling its content off Hulu to populate Peacock, reducing the quality of the very platform it would eventually have to sell to Disney at a fixed minimum price. In November of 2023, Disney purchased NBC's stake for $8.6 billion. NBC received a significant check. Disney received complete ownership of a platform now worth substantially more than the price paid. NBC had built part of the infrastructure of the streaming era and then stepped aside just before the largest returns arrived. Google's story with Motorola has a different texture because it wasn't entirely a mistake. In August of 2011, Google announced it was acquiring Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion. The stated rationale was patents, a massive library of mobile technology patents that would protect Android against legal challenges from competitors. The hardware business was a secondary consideration.
But Motorola was losing over $1 billion annually. Its phones were falling behind Samsung and Apple in both design and market share. Google tried to revive the lineup with new models, but the margin stayed thin, and the competition kept accelerating. By January of 2014, less than 3 years after the acquisition, Google sold Motorola to Lenovo for $2.9 billion, retaining the patent library it had actually wanted. More than $9 billion had effectively been spent to acquire a set of patents. Was it a mistake? That depends on how you value the legal protection those patents provided for Android during a period of intense industry litigation. But if the math is simply purchase price minus sale price, Google paid $9 billion more than it needed to for what it kept. Better math up front would have been less dramatic and significantly cheaper. The Yahoo story is perhaps the cleanest example of timing. Specifically, what happens when you build something before the infrastructure exists to support it? In April of 1999, Yahoo paid $5.7 billion for a company called Broadcast.com. The pitch was online video at scale. Sports, radio, streaming content, the future of media delivered through an internet connection. At that moment, the idea was legitimate. Online video was real. The demand was real. The problem was the delivery infrastructure. Most users in 1999 were on dial-up connections. Streaming a single video could take longer than watching it. Bandwidth costs were enormous and climbing. Content partnerships required ongoing payments Yahoo hadn't modeled accurately. The integration stalled. The platform
faded. By 2002, Broadcast.com was shut down entirely. Mark Cuban, who had co-founded the company, walked away a billionaire. Yahoo walked away with a platform that was correct about the future, but a decade early for the present, and no plan for surviving the gap between those two things. The idea of online video wasn't wrong. It became one of the most valuable industries in the world. YouTube, Netflix, streaming services, the market Broadcast.com was pointing toward is now worth trillions.
Yahoo just didn't have a bridge to get there. 10 companies, 10 different industries, 10 different eras, and the same fundamental error running through all of them. Not incompetence, not laziness, not corruption, at least not in most cases, a failure to accurately price what they were looking at. Fox couldn't price what Star Wars would become, so they gave away the rights for nothing. Xerox couldn't price what the personal computer would become, so they let Jobs walk out with the blueprint. Atari couldn't price what the NES would become, so they let a contract dispute end the conversation. The Beatles management couldn't price what their catalog would become, so it slipped through their hands for less than £2 million. On the other side, Microsoft overpaid for Skype because they overpriced what it could become inside their ecosystem. HP overpaid for autonomy because they overpriced a transformation that was never real. Google overpaid for Motorola because they needed the patents but bought the whole company to get them.
NBC underpriced what Hulu would become and locked in a sale price before the value arrived. Yahoo correctly priced the future, but failed to price the cost of surviving until the future got there. Every single one of these failures lives in the same category: the gap between what something is today and what it will be tomorrow, and the inability to see that gap clearly in either direction. You might be reading this thinking these are distant corporate stories, old boardroom decisions, history, but the same gap exists in decisions being made right now. Right now, somewhere, a company is looking at an emerging technology and dismissing it, the way Fox dismissed merchandising rights, the way Xerox dismissed the personal computer, the way Atari dismissed a console deal over a procedural argument.
And somewhere else, a company is paying a significant premium for an acquisition that looks compelling on the surface, but doesn't hold up under the numbers. The way Microsoft paid for a product it would later build itself. The way HP paid for a company that wasn't what it claimed to be. The lesson isn't to be more aggressive or more cautious. The lesson is to be more accurate. Accurate about what something is worth. Not what it costs today, not what it might be worth in the best possible scenario, but what it is actually worth given the evidence available. Because the most expensive decisions in business history were almost never made by people who didn't care. They were made by people who were looking at the right thing and seeing it wrong.
Walt Disney arrived in New York in March of 1928, expecting to renew a contract for a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a character his studio had built from nothing. He left the meeting with nothing. The distributor owned Oswald completely. His animators had been quietly hired away. He had no character, no staff, and no leverage. On the train ride home, nearly broke and without a clear direction, he started sketching. Round ears, a simple grin, a different character. On November 18, 1928, Mickey Mouse debuted in Steamboat Willie. Oswald stayed at Universal and faded from cultural memory. Mickey became the foundation of a company worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Disney didn't lose a character. He lost one version of the future and found a better one.
Not every miscalculation leads somewhere better. Most of them don't. But every single one of them starts in the same place. Someone looking at something real and not seeing it clearly. The question worth asking in any decision that actually matters is a simple one. What am I looking at right now that I might be pricing wrong? Because the history of business is full of people who found out the answer too late.